The words landed with the weight of a gavel. Pack your things, you're done. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany boardroom table, the same table where I'd spent 14 years presenting system designs, operational reports, and disaster recovery plans that kept this company alive through 3 economic downturns. Ethan Carter leaned back in his chair, the overhead lights glinting off the polished steel of his cufflinks. That smirk, the one he used when he thought he'd just outmaneuvered someone, was plastered across his face. I'd seen it before, when he undercut a competitor in a merger deal, when he pitched my architecture as his innovation to a government client, when he won an award for visionary leadership built on my sleepless months of code and contingency plans. Around the table, 12 board members sat in perfect stillness. Some glanced down at their notes. One, Patricia Lane, adjusted her glasses in a small, practiced gesture that told me she wanted no part in what was about to happen. Not a single person met my eyes. My name is Daniel Ross. I'm 48 years old, Chief Systems Architect. Or I was, up until about 3 seconds ago. 14 years of my life had been poured into building the backbone of Orion Gate Technologies, line by line, server by server. I didn't move right away. I let the silence stretch, let Ethan's smile deepen as if my pause was a sign of defeat. In truth, I was measuring the seconds the same way you count down before a launch, knowing every system is armed and ready. Finally, I reached into my suit jacket. My security badge slid across the table, stopping just short of Ethan's perfectly manicured hands. My laptop followed, heavy, dented in one corner from a conference trip years ago, but still a vault of everything that made this company tick. Then I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Calm as still water. Then you'd better tell the investors why everything will be offline in 10 minutes. The smirk twitched. Just a flicker, but enough. Around the table, 3 sets of eyes shot toward Ethan, and Patricia's pen stopped moving mid-note. Someone shifted in their leather chair, and the sound was loud in the quiet. Ethan blinked once, leaned forward. "What are you talking about?" His voice was measured, but I caught the faintest edge of concern. I didn't answer. Not yet. I stood, adjusted my tie with deliberate care, and took one last look at the table I'd helped fill with contracts and clients. Every server, every security protocol, every proprietary system that kept this place running, I knew them like my own heartbeat. And in exactly 9 minutes and 40 seconds, they would all stop. The room smelled faintly of coffee and varnished wood. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking over the board's left shoulder. I could also feel Ethan's eyes following me as I walked toward the double doors. Patricia Lane adjusted her glasses again. One of the junior board members glanced at his phone, no doubt checking if he'd missed something in the meeting agenda. No one said a word. Halfway to the door, I turned back. "You've got a client call with Pacific Industrial in an hour, don't you?" I asked, almost conversational. "Better hope they're patient." Ethan's jaw tightened. The polished brass handles were cold under my hands. The room was still silent when I pulled the doors open, stepped into the carpeted hallway, and let them swing shut behind me with a soft, final thud. Out here, away from their polite theater, the air felt lighter. I could hear my own footsteps echo as I walked toward the elevator, each one carrying me further from the boardroom's smug smiles and carefully averted gazes. Somewhere behind that door, I imagined the first whispers starting. A lean toward a neighbor, a hushed, "Did he just say 10 minutes?" Someone, probably Patricia, beginning to connect the dots between my calm exit and the company's dependency on the systems only I could restart. I pressed the elevator button and slipped my hands into my pockets. The doors slid open almost immediately, a polished mirror reflecting my face, steady, unreadable, not a trace of the storm brewing inside. As the elevator doors closed, I caught a muffled burst of voices from the boardroom. One sharp, hurried tone cut through, followed by the scrape of a chair leg against the floor. The first wave of panic had just hit. 9 minutes, I thought. Plenty of time for them to realize exactly what they'd just done. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing me off from the boardroom's stale air and Ethan Carter's smug face. For a moment, all I heard was the hum of the lift and the faint creak of its cables. Then, muffled but unmistakable, the shouting started. It bled through the heavy wood doors like the sound of a distant storm. Someone barked my name. Another voice demanded I'd get upstairs now. I watched the floor numbers light up above the doors one by one, my reflection faint in the polished metal. Calm, always calm. Last month, I'd installed a protocol no one else fully understood, not even Jason Leary, my so-called assistant. It was officially called a comprehensive core reboot cycle in the maintenance logs. To me, it was a lockbox. Every 30 days, the system would automatically initiate a complete shutdown. Servers, databases, communication lines, cloud sync, all of it. The restart required two things: my biometric signature and a rolling authentication code that only I generated. No me, no restart. It was the kind of safeguard you build after watching one too many close calls, an insurance policy against disasters, cyber attacks, and, apparently, short-sighted CEOs with too much ego and too little foresight. I'd kept the setup quiet. In official documentation, it was just scheduled preventative maintenance. Even the board had nodded it through without reading past the first line of my report. No one wanted to dive into the technical weeds when they could be at lunch with a client. The elevator dinged softly as I descended past the 20th floor. Through the narrow gap where the doors met, I caught flashes of movement in the hallway outside the boardroom. People in suits jogging toward the IT department, phones pressed to their ears. The hum of the lift was interrupted again, this time by the echo of more voices. "Check the firewall logs!" and "Where's Brandon? Get him in here!" Brandon, Jason, they'd both be scrambling to look competent now, digging through systems they only half understood, realizing the control panel might as well be written in a language they'd never learned. I leaned back against the wall, the leather of my briefcase warm against my hand. In 8 minutes, Orion Gate Technologies would experience a silence it had never known before. The servers would blink off. The secure client portals would vanish into 404 errors. Email would choke mid-send. Even the security cameras in the lobby would go dark. The timing wasn't just poetic, it was precise. At 11 a.m. sharp, Ethan was scheduled to host a remote investor presentation for Pacific Industrial. $28 million on the line, months of contract courting, every chart, demo, and secure document stored in systems only I could unlock. I'd spent a decade preparing the infrastructure for moments like that. Seamless integration, lightning-fast retrieval, airtight data security. And I was about to watch it all vanish on his watch. The elevator slowed, and for a second, I thought about how quickly all of this had escalated. 15 minutes ago, I'd been sitting at that table, letting him perform his little power play in front of the board. Now the building was quietly tilting toward chaos. The doors opened on the ground floor. From my position just inside the lift, I could see across the open-plan reception area. A receptionist was already fielding multiple calls at once, her headset cord wrapped around her fingers. A man in a gray suit jogged past the glass front doors, re-entering from the street, phone to his ear, face pale. I stepped out, walking at an unhurried pace toward the parking garage entrance. Around me, the pace of everyone else had doubled. 2 junior analysts rushed past, one muttering to the other, "It's the core servers. They're shutting down, but the credentials aren't working." Behind them, a security guard strode toward the elevators, probably sent to fetch me back upstairs. Too late. The hallway to the garage smelled faintly of motor oil and concrete dust. My footsteps echoed in the long tunnel until they were drowned out by the muffled wail of a phone on speaker somewhere in the lobby. 7 minutes. I imagined Ethan in the boardroom, his tie slightly askew now, gesturing for everyone to stay calm, while internally calculating the disaster about to hit. Jason would be hunched over a terminal in the IT suite, furiously typing passwords that led nowhere. The realization would be sinking in. There was no workaround. The lockout was absolute. And up there, sitting in the lobby of Pacific Industrial's headquarters, a dozen investors would be waiting for a link to load, a link that was about to dissolve into nothing. I reached my truck, parked in the same corner spot I'd used for 14 years. The same spot Ethan had once tried to reassign to a VP with a golf club membership. I rested my briefcase on the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. 6 minutes. The phone on my dashboard lit up with a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. Instead, I let the vibration buzz against the cup holder, a tiny metronome marking the seconds left before the blackout. The thing about systems like mine is they're loyal, they do exactly what they're told. And for years, I'd told Orion Gate's systems one simple thing: trust no one but me. 14 years ago, Ethan Carter and I were just two guys in a one-car garage that smelled of solder and burnt coffee. He had a head for deals, a voice that could sell a thermostat to a man living in the tropics. I had the hands, the code, the circuits, the hours spent hunched over a desk building something from nothing. We'd met at a tech conference in Chicago. I was giving a quiet, poorly attended talk on scalable municipal data systems. He was working the networking floor like it was a casino table, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, wearing a suit that looked borrowed but fit perfectly. Afterward, he found me in the hotel bar. "You've got the brains," he said, "and I've got the mouth. We could make something happen." He wasn't wrong. We shook hands over a napkin scrawled with an idea, Orion Gate Technologies, and started the next morning with a stack of takeout boxes and 2 second-hand laptops. The early years were brutal. 12-hour days bled into 18-hour nights. We built custom software for hardware stores, auto parts suppliers, anyone who'd pay a few $1,000s for inventory tracking that actually worked. I wrote every line of code. Ethan sold every contract. We'd celebrate closing a deal by ordering pizza and letting it go cold while I debugged something that wouldn't compile. It worked because we trusted each other. My world was the servers. His was the suits. When we finally moved out of the garage into a proper office, we didn't just feel like partners, we felt like brothers. The first crack came with the citywide infrastructure project. Fort Wayne was upgrading its entire municipal traffic management system, and our bid won by a hair. It was the biggest job we'd ever landed, one of those contracts that could make a reputation permanent. For 8 months, I lived inside that project. Every light, every sensor, every backup protocol was mine. I walked the streets at 2 in the morning, testing signal synchronization with a tablet in hand. I wrote redundancies on redundancies so a power outage in one district wouldn't gridlock the entire city. When the system went live, it worked flawlessly. The city saw smoother traffic flow within a week. Accident rates dipped. Local news called it the most efficient rollout in Fort Wayne's history. Then came the press conference. I watched it on a monitor in the office, exhausted but proud. The mayor stood at the podium, flanked by city officials, and Ethan. No mention of me. No mention of my team. The words, "visionary leadership," rolled off the mayor's tongue, and the cameras panned to Ethan nodding humbly, taking credit like he'd written every line himself. When I confronted him later, he brushed it off with that salesman's grin. "You know how it is, Dan. I'm the face. You're the brains. Clients like seeing the guy they negotiated with. Don't take it personally." I told myself I wouldn't. But something in me shifted that day. Over the next 2 years, Ethan's circle changed. Gone were the engineers and analysts we'd built the company with. In came polished talkers with thin resumes and thick wallets. Guys who laughed at his jokes, agreed with his every whim, and called him boss even at the bar after work. I started getting left out of meetings. First, it was "this one's more about client relations." Then, "the board's discussing strategic partnerships, nothing technical." Soon, I was learning about major contracts from internal memos rather than direct conversations. The new hires weren't there to solve problems. They were there to make Ethan look untouchable. I'd see them in the hallway, laughing about golf trips, dropping hints about big changes coming. Once I walked into the conference room mid-discussion, something about rebranding our core services. They all went silent until Ethan smiled that politician's smile and said, "Dan, don't worry about this one. We've got it covered." It wasn't that I stopped caring about the company. If anything, I cared more. I doubled down on security protocols, streamlined our infrastructure, made sure that no matter who was in the room upstairs, the system wouldn't collapse under their bad decisions. But the air was different. The brotherhood was gone. And in its place was a hierarchy, Ethan at the top, his yes-men just below, and me somewhere down in the server room, invisible until something broke. That was the real beginning of the end. I didn't know it then, but the trust we'd built in that garage was already gone. Ethan had found a new kind of partner, the kind that didn't build anything, didn't question him, and never asked for a share of the credit. He must have thought I'd stay in my lane forever. He was wrong. Jason Leary showed up on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, fresh out of grad school, hair perfectly styled, tie a little too tight. Ethan introduced him in the break room like we were meeting the company's next prodigy. "Jason's here to lighten your workload, Dan," Ethan said, clapping me on the shoulder. Can't have our chief systems architect buried in maintenance tickets when we've got bigger fish to fry. I shook Jason's hand. His grip was firm, his smile practiced. He looked like the kind of kid who'd been told his whole life he was destined for the corner office. Happy to help, Jason said. I've read a lot about your work here. At first, I tried to take it at face value. Maybe we did need someone to handle the smaller tasks, the routine updates, the help desk escalations. I'd been working 12-hour days for months on the Pacific Industrial contract. An extra set of hands couldn't hurt, but within a week I realized Jason wasn't here to help me. He spent more time in Ethan's office than at his own desk. I'd see him through the glass wall, sitting across from Ethan, leaning forward like a student in a one-on-one tutorial. Sometimes they'd both be looking at diagrams I'd drawn, or my infrastructure flowcharts. When he was at his desk, he was asking me questions, always about the undocumented parts of the system. Not the things you could learn from the operations manual or the onboarding binder, but the little quirks only I knew. How do you bypass the auto restart sequence if the primary node fails? What's the quickest way to reset the client-side encryption keys? Which server stores the redundant authentication logs? On their own, they were harmless questions. Together, they started to form a pattern. Jason wasn't learning how to help me. He was mapping my brain. One night, a couple of weeks in, I stayed late to finish a round of stress tests. It was close to midnight when I walked past Jason's desk and saw his monitor still glowing. He wasn't there. Curiosity made me slow down. The screen was open to one of my secured directories, a folder with restricted access that even most senior engineers couldn't touch. It held the core configuration files for our municipal infrastructure clients, including Fort Wayne's traffic management system. Jason's external drive was plugged into the USB port progress bar halfway through. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there watching the percentage tick up until Jason came back from wherever he'd gone. "Hey," he said, too casually, glancing at the screen. "Ethan asked me to make a backup of your configurations for an upcoming audit." "An audit," I repeated. "Yeah, compliance stuff." I didn't argue, not then. I just unplugged the drive, closed the folder, and told him, if there's an audit, it goes through me. The next morning, I walked into Ethan's office and asked him directly. "Jason was copying secured configuration files last night. He said you told him to do it for an audit." Ethan didn't even blink. "That's right, we've got an external review coming up. The board wants all the critical systems documented and backed up. Nothing to worry about. Except I knew exactly how our audits worked. They were scheduled months in advance, and I was always the one who coordinated with the auditors. No such review was on the calendar." "Next time, tell me first," I said. "Of course," Ethan replied, smiling in that way he did when the conversation was over, or when he wanted me to think it was. But something in my gut shifted that day. From then on, I noticed Jason hovering a little too close when I was working. He'd lean over my shoulder under the guise of learning the ropes, eyes scanning my keystrokes. If I left my desk for a meeting, I'd find my chair slightly moved when I came back. Once I caught a faint whiff of his cologne lingering in my office when I knew I'd locked the door behind me. It wasn't outright hostile, not yet, but it was invasive and it was deliberate. I started locking down more than just my office. Certain processes I stopped running during the day. Passwords I changed twice a week. New encryption layers went in quietly, undocumented, known only to me. Paranoia is a funny thing. It makes you see shadows in every corner. But in my line of work, shadows usually mean something's blocking the light. And I could feel it. A slow, deliberate effort to push me out of my own systems. Jason wasn't here to lighten my workload. He was here to replace me. I just didn't know how soon Ethan planned to make that official. It was 3 weeks before the boardroom ambush when Ethan called me into his office. His tone over the phone was different. Clipped, businesslike, without the forced warmth he used when other people were listening. When I walked in, Jason was already there, perched in the corner chair like a student waiting for instructions. Ethan gestured toward the seat across from his desk. "Dan, we've been talking about security protocols." I nodded, waiting. "The board has some concerns," he went on. "They feel it's risky for critical system access to be tied to a single person. What if you're unavailable during a crisis? Out sick, traveling. something happens. I'd heard versions of this argument before. Usually it came from someone who didn't understand that too much access was more dangerous than too little. Ethan, the access is limited for a reason, I said. We're talking about the keys to every system we run. Municipal infrastructure, client data, our own core servers. The fewer people who have them, the less chance of compromise. Jason shifted in his seat, glancing between us. Ethan leaned forward. What if we bring a couple of other senior staff into the loop? You, me, Jason here. Maybe Patricia from the board. No, I said, sharper than I intended. Patricia's not technical, and you don't need day-to-day access. Neither does Jason. If something happens to me, we have documented emergency overrides in place. That's the correct protocol. Ethan's eyes cooled a few degrees. So you're refusing? I'm following best practices, I replied evenly. If you want to compromise security, you'll need to put that in writing, signed by the board. I won't be the one responsible when it backfires. The room went still for a moment. Jason looked down at his hands, and Ethan just stared at me with that smile that wasn't really a smile. All right, Dan, he said finally. We'll table it for now. But I knew the conversation wasn't over. After that, the meetings without me became more frequent. First, it was just the occasional strategy session I wasn't invited to. Then, whole project updates were happening without my input. I'd get CC'd on an email with decisions already made, timelines shifted, client promises expanded, all without anyone consulting the person who would actually have to make them happen. Jason's presence in those meetings didn't need to be confirmed. I could see it in the way he'd come back to his desk afterward, eyes bright with the self-importance of someone who'd been in the room where the real discussions were happening. I started hearing little things from other departments, marketing, asking if certain security features could be ready earlier than scheduled. Sales talking about Jason's ideas for infrastructure tweaks, small careless slips in conversation that told me my work, my designs, were being funneled through someone else. One Friday afternoon, I overheard Jason in the break room telling someone from HR, "Dan's been great about showing me the ins and outs. I think I'll be able to take over most of his stuff soon." He said it like he was talking about covering a colleague's shift, not absorbing 14 years of accumulated expertise. I walked past without a word, but my jaw ached from holding it shut. In hindsight, the signs were obvious. The increased collaboration with Jason, the gentle prodding to share access, the strategic exclusion from key meetings. But at the time, I still thought I was just dealing with bad management. The kind of short-sighted decision-making that had plagued plenty of companies I'd worked with in the early days. I told myself they couldn't possibly be grooming someone else to take my place. Not when the systems were so intricate, so tied to my knowledge. That was my mistake. The truth is, I was training my own replacement. Every answer I gave Jason, every diagram I sketched on a whiteboard, every shortcut I pointed out, all of it was being collected, cataloged, and repackaged as knowledge transfer, and I didn't see it for what it was until it was too late. One night, about a week before the firing, I stayed late to finalize some upgrades on the Pacific Industrial Project. The office was quiet, the kind of stillness that only settles after the cleaning crew has come and gone. As I walked toward the server room, I passed Ethan's office. The lights were on. Inside, he and Jason were leaning over my network map, the one I kept locked in my drawer. Jason had a notepad in front of him, copying details line by line. Ethan looked up when he saw me. "Dan, we were just discussing some contingency planning." I didn't answer. I just stood there long enough for Jason to stop writing. Then I turned and walked away. In that moment, the last thread of trust snapped. They weren't just circling my position. They were dismantling it piece by piece, making sure that when the time came, the only thing missing from the picture would be me. I didn't know when they'd make their move, but I knew I had to be ready for it. The parking garage was cool and echoing, the kind of silence you only get underground. My footsteps bounced back at me as I crossed the concrete toward my truck, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I'd parked in the same corner spot for 14 years. The oil stain beneath the front bumper was mine, the product of an old gasket that leaked back in 2013. Ethan had once tried to give this spot to a VP who'd just joined from a competitor. I'd pushed back not because I cared about asphalt hierarchy, but because I'd earned it. 14 years in the same space becomes a kind of anchor. I opened the driver's side door, tossed my briefcase onto the passenger seat, and slid in behind the wheel. That's when my phone lit up on the dashboard. Ethan Carter. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. Dan, he said, his voice tight but feigning casual. We need to talk. 7 minutes, I replied, glancing at the clock on my dash. Better make it quick. Look, maybe I was hasty back there. Ethan started. The board's been on me for months about cutting costs, bringing in outside consultants. I was trying to make some moves. Firing me in front of the board was a move, I said evenly. You made it. Now you get to live with it. I think we can work something out, he pressed. Stock options, a consulting contract, generous severance, whatever makes sense. I almost laughed. 3 minutes ago I was disposable, now I'm worth bargaining with. This isn't about that, Ethan said, and I could hear the strain leaking into his voice. It's about the company. We've got Pacific Industrial at 11, $28 million on the table. We can't afford downtime. You should have thought of that before you cut the person who could prevent it. A pause on the line. Somewhere in the background I caught muffled voices. Urgent. Clipped. The sound of shoes on tile. A door slamming. Dan, be reasonable, Ethan said. We're both professionals here. What do you want? Money? A title? I can make it happen. What I want, I said, is for you to understand what 14 years meant. Nights in the server room. Weekends rewriting code because a vendor shipped bad firmware. Covering for your overpromises so clients never knew we were scrambling. I know. No, you don't. Because if you did, you wouldn't have spent the last year grooming my replacement. In the background, the muffled voices rose to shouting. Someone barked, "Credentials don't match." Another voice, "Try the override." 6 minutes. Dan. Ethan's voice dropped, the salesman's gloss starting to peel. This could get ugly. If we lose Pacific, it's not just the contract. It's our reputation. You think the board's going to forget that? Probably not, I said, just like I'm not forgetting that you took credit for Fort Wayne or that you've been stripping me out of meetings for months. All right, he said, fast now, trying to shove the words through before I could hang up. Here's what I can do. $50,000 a month as a consultant, 3-year contract, full benefits. We wire you a signing bonus today. Just get the systems back up. I leaned back in my seat, the cool leather pressing into my shoulders. You don't get it? This isn't about money. It's about the fact that you made me irrelevant until you needed me. 5 minutes, I could almost picture him now, standing in the boardroom, tie loose, jaw tight, the smirk long gone. Jason would be at the far end of the table, fingers flying uselessly over a keyboard, sweating under the weight of everyone's eyes. In the distance, a car door slammed in the garage. Someone's footsteps echoed. Fast, purposeful. Dan, Ethan said, and now there was desperation in it. Just tell me what it's going to take. I smiled to myself. It's going to take you remembering this moment every time you think loyalty doesn't matter. 4 minutes. Silence on the line, then you'll regret this. Maybe, I said, but not today. I hung up. The phone buzzed almost immediately. Same number. I let it go to voicemail. Above me, the building still looked calm from the outside, but I knew the inside was unraveling, emails bouncing back undelivered, client dashboards timing out, the little digital heartbeat of Orion Gate Technologies flatlining in real time. 3 minutes to blackout. Brennan's Diner sat at the edge of the freeway, the kind of place where the coffee never tasted good but was always hot. And the booths had been reupholstered so many times they were practically bulletproof. I picked it because it was neutral ground, public enough that Ethan wouldn't try to make a scene, quiet enough that I could watch him squirm without an audience of my own employees. I'd been there maybe 10 minutes nursing a cup of burnt coffee when I spotted the black BMW pulling into the lot. Ethan was driving. Jason sat in the passenger seat, his tie loosened, face pale under the dashboard light. They didn't come in right away. I watched through the window as Ethan paced beside the car, phone in hand, saying something sharp enough to make Jason wince. Then finally, they crossed the lot and pushed through the diner door. Ethan slid into the booth across from me. Jason followed, sitting on the outside like he wasn't sure he wanted to be trapped in this conversation. Both of them looked like they'd aged 5 years since the board meeting. Let's just get to it, Ethan said, not bothering with small talk. I'm listening, I said. He pulled a folder from his leather briefcase and slid it across the table. Inside was a contract, neat, formal, and laughably transparent. $45,000, he said, for a 90-day transition, consulting title. We wire the first payment today. In exchange, you provide complete system documentation, access credentials, and oversee the handoff to Jason. I didn't touch the folder. Instead, I took a slow sip of coffee, let the silence stretch until Ethan's jaw tightened. 45,000, I said finally. For 14 years of institutional knowledge. Every system, every protocol, every workaround I built from scratch, that's what you think it's worth? It's a generous offer, considering the circumstances, Ethan said. I couldn't help it. I laughed, a short, sharp sound that made Jason glance down at the menu like he could disappear into it. You think this is about money? I asked. Ethan blinked, and in that half second, I saw the first crack in his armor. This isn't about a payout, I continued. It's about the fact that 3 weeks ago, you decided I was expendable, that you could replace me with someone who didn't understand the difference between a maintenance log and a kill switch. Now, you're sitting here pretending we're negotiating. Ethan leaned forward. Dan, I'm offering you a way to walk away clean. No lawsuits, no bad press. Just sign the contract, get paid, and move on. I set my cup down. Funny you should mention moving on. You know who called me 3 weeks ago? He didn't answer, but his eyes narrowed. Orion Tech, I said. Your favorite competitor. They'd been following my work for months, impressed with the security protocols I designed for Fort Wayne and the municipal contracts. Offered me a senior role, director of systems architecture, twice the salary you were paying me, stock options, signing bonus. Jason's head jerked up at that. Ethan's face stayed still, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. You're bluffing, he said. I pulled my phone from my pocket and set it on the table. The missed call log lit up the screen. 7 calls from Orion Tech's CTO, James Harper, between 7:30 that morning and the moment I walked out of the boardroom. They called again during your little performance today, I said. Left a voicemail asking if I was ready to discuss opportunities. Said they'd heard rumors about management changes at Orion Gate. For the first time since he walked in, Ethan's mouth went tight, his gaze flicking briefly toward Jason like maybe the kid could explain how this had happened. I leaned back, letting the weight of it sink in. You wanted me gone so badly you didn't stop to think who might want me instead. That's not, Ethan started but stopped when I raised a hand. You've spent months cutting me out, feeding my work to someone who didn't earn it, taking credit for projects you barely understood. And now, when the walls start closing in, you show up with a folder full of hush money and think I'll save you. Jason looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Ethan's confidence, that easy smirk I'd seen 1,000 times, was gone. In its place was calculation, and under that, something that looked an awful lot like fear. I pushed the contract folder back across the table. 45,000 won't buy what you're asking for, and even if it could, I wouldn't sell it to you. Outside, a truck downshifted on the freeway, the sound rumbling through the glass. Inside, neither of them spoke. For the first time all day, the balance of power in the room had shifted, and we all knew it. Ethan broke the silence first, leaning back in the booth like he was trying to reclaim a little space. Dan, whatever Orion Tech offered you, we can match it. Hell, we can beat it. You've got history here, relationships. I held up a hand. Ethan, this isn't about Orion Tech's offer. Jason glanced between us, brows knit. Then what is this about? I let him ask, let the question hang in the air for a few seconds before answering. It's about ownership. Specifically, mine. Ethan frowned. What are you talking about? Every major system I've built for Orion Gate over the past 14 years, I said. Every critical upgrade, every new security protocol. I patented them. Jason blinked like he'd misheard me. Ethan's jaw actually dropped before he caught himself. You can't patent company property, Ethan said quickly, that CEO edge creeping into his voice. I smiled, slow, deliberate. That's where you're wrong. You can't patent their intellectual property. But under federal law, the actual inventor, the one who conceives and develops the system, holds the right to file a patent in their own name unless a contract explicitly transfers those rights. You never had one. My attorney made sure of it. Jason looked like someone had just unplugged him. Ethan sat very still, calculating, probably scanning through 14 years of paperwork in his head and realizing there was nothing with my signature that could override what I'd just said. I leaned forward. You own the code in your repositories, but the underlying systems, the architecture, the protocols that make them secure and functional, those are mine. And as of this morning, Orion Tech has acquired exclusive rights to those patents for the next 5 years. Jason swallowed. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Exclusive rights? Meaning, I said, they're the only ones allowed to use them, which means you aren't. The air between us tightened. Ethan laughed once, a short, humorless bark. You think you can shut down my company because of some paperwork trick? No, I said. I don't think. I know. Because without those systems, you can't legally run your municipal contracts, your infrastructure clients, your security integrations. You can't even run Pacific Industrial's presentation today without infringing, and that's before we talk about lawsuits for unauthorized use. Jason looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Ethan's smirk, the one that used to irritate me but never surprise me, was gone completely now. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across to him. Inside was a one-page document. The licensing agreement Orion Tech had authorized me to present. Ethan flipped it open, scanning the first paragraph. His eyes stopped halfway down the page. 55% of gross revenue. That's the licensing fee, I said. If you want to keep using my systems, you'll pay it. Every contract, every invoice, every dollar tied to those patents, more than half goes to Orion Tech. They get the lion's share, I get my cut, and you keep the lights on. Without it, you're done. Ethan's voice was low now. You can't be serious. I sat back. You spent the last year making me irrelevant. Now you're finding out I was the only thing standing between you and bankruptcy. For a moment, the only sounds were the hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter and the clink of a spoon in a mug somewhere across the diner. Jason finally spoke, voice shaky. Is there any other option? Sure, I said. Rebuild your entire infrastructure from scratch. Replace every protocol, every integration point, every security layer. Hire a team of senior engineers who can do it in, maybe 3 years, if they're very, very good. And in the meantime, watch your clients walk to competitors who already have working systems. Ethan's hands clenched on the edge of the table. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring down at the contract like it was a snake. You did this deliberately, he said. I didn't blink. I did this intelligently. You always told me to think ahead. I did. He shoved the folder back toward me but didn't speak. I didn't need him to. I'd seen enough CEOs cornered to know that right now he was running numbers in his head, calculating just how bad the bleeding would be. I'll give you a week, I said, standing. After that, the offer's off the table. Orion Tech will happily take your clients without the licensing headache. I left a 20 on the table for the coffee, turned, and walked toward the door. Behind me, neither of them moved. For the first time since the boardroom, I wasn't just walking away from Ethan Carter. I was walking away holding the detonator, and we both knew it. The thing about a company like Orion Gate is that it looks solid from the outside. Big contracts, polished branding, polished executives shaking hands in glossy press photos. But the inside, it's all load-bearing systems, invisible to anyone who isn't in the server room. And I had built every single one of them. Within 2 weeks of that diner meeting, the cracks started showing. It began with small outages. A client in Chicago reported that their secure portal was timing out. Then a municipal contract in Ohio flagged data inconsistencies in its reporting dashboard. Without my maintenance schedules, patches, and the daily adjustments I made without thinking, the whole ecosystem started to drift off balance. By week 3, Pacific Industrial, the same $28 million whale Ethan had been courting, pulled out entirely. The systems for their demonstration were too unstable to risk a partnership. That single contract loss triggered a chain reaction. Smaller clients, sensing weakness, began terminating agreements before they could be left holding the bag. And then Fort Wayne happened. The traffic management system I'd built for the city, the one that had run without a single critical failure in 8 years, went dark for 36 hours straight. Traffic lights froze red in multiple districts. Emergency vehicles had to be rerouted manually. Local news ran helicopter footage of gridlocked intersections, horns blaring, pedestrians darting between stalled cars. The city council filed a breach of contract lawsuit before the lights were even back on. The damages alone would have wiped out a quarter of Orion Gate's annual revenue. But more than the money, it destroyed their reputation. Every municipal client that had once trusted them started making quiet inquiries with competitors. I didn't have to guess who those competitors were calling. Orion Tech's onboarding department had a record month. Meanwhile, inside Orion Gate, the triage had turned desperate. Ethan threw money at contract engineers trying to cobble together replacements for my patented systems. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. They couldn't just swap out the architecture. My code wasn't a layer they could peel away. It was the foundation. Jason lasted about 5 weeks before Ethan cut him loose. I heard from an old contact in HR that the official line was restructuring. But the truth was simpler. He wasn't qualified to fix what was breaking. He'd been trained to take over an existing machine, not build a new one from the ground up. Without me there to handhold him through every glitch, he was as lost as the rest of them. Ethan didn't stop fighting, though. He burned through hundreds of thousands in legal fees trying to challenge my patents. 3 different law firms, each promising they could find a loophole, each walking away when they realized the filings were airtight. I'd kept immaculate records, every line of code tied to a timestamp, every diagram annotated and dated. Witness statements from the engineers who'd worked under me confirming I was the sole architect. My attorney had warned me years ago to prepare for exactly this. And I had. Somewhere between the second failed injunction and the third rejected appeal, Ethan must have realized it. They thought I was a security risk. They were right, just not in the way they imagined. The risk wasn't that I'd break something out of spite. The risk was that I'd built it so well they could never break free from it without me. From my office at Orion Tech, I watched it all unfold. Not with glee, that's not my style, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who's been underestimated for too long. I'd get the occasional industry email. Did you hear about Orion Gate losing the Denver contract? You see Fort Wayne's lawsuit? Guess who just signed with Orion Tech? It was all the same story, told in different ways. Ethan Carter had gambled on the idea that my work was interchangeable. He'd bet the company on it, and he'd lost. The last update I heard from inside came from a former Orion Gate project manager who'd jumped ship to Orion Tech. She told me the mood over there was like a party that's run out of booze, music still playing, but nobody dancing. By the end of the second month, even the music had stopped. The first Monday at Orion Tech felt like stepping into a different universe. The office was open, bright, and quiet in the way that comes from confidence, not fear. The systems team actually smiled when they saw me, and not the tight, polite smile you give an executive you can't stand. These people wanted to work together. My title, Director of Systems Architecture, came with a bigger office than I'd ever had, a salary Ethan would have called unrealistic, equity in the company, and stock options that made my retirement something I could plan instead of daydream about. James Harper, Orion Tech's CTO, handed me my badge with a grin and said, "You don't need to prove yourself here, Dan. We already know what you can do. Now we just want you to do it." That alone was worth more than the paycheck. My days fell into a rhythm I'd forgotten was possible. Mornings spent reviewing infrastructure plans over good coffee, afternoons in collaborative meetings where my input wasn't just tolerated, it was sought out. And when I went home in the evenings, I left work at the office. The constant hum of anxiety I'd carried at Orion Gate, wondering who was undermining me, what decision had been made behind closed doors, was gone. Kelly noticed it first. "You're actually resting," she said one night, leaning against the kitchen counter while I chopped vegetables. "You're not checking your phone every 5 minutes. You're not pacing the living room muttering about security breaches that don't exist. Now that's because the people here know what they're doing," I told her, "and they want me to succeed. It's different." The financial security changed things for her too. Kelly had always been an artist. Oil paints, landscapes, the occasional portrait. But for years, she'd kept it as a hobby because the bills had to be paid. With my new salary, she didn't have to make that choice anymore. By the end of my first quarter at Orion Tech, she'd converted the spare room into a full studio. Canvases lined the walls, sunlight poured in through the big front window, and for the first time in our marriage, she could spend entire afternoons working on a piece without feeling guilty about not being productive. Watching her paint without that weight on her shoulders was a different kind of reward, one Ethan Carter could never have offered, even if he'd wanted to. Ethan's name didn't come up much anymore, except in industry gossip. From what I heard, he'd landed a mid-level sales job for a software distributor in Cleveland. No board meetings, no corner office, no one calling him visionary in press releases. A contact who'd bumped into him at a conference told me he looked smaller, not physically. Ethan had always kept himself in shape, but in presence, like a man who'd once held a spotlight and now couldn't even get near the stage. As for Jason, the wunderkind who was supposed to replace me, last I heard, he was working at a small maintenance shop in Indianapolis, fixing outdated systems for clients who couldn't afford an upgrade. There was nothing personal in that for me. He'd been a pawn in Ethan's game. But there was a certain poetic balance in knowing he'd gone from shadowing me in a glass-walled office to crawling under desks to replace routers. Every so often, someone at Orion Tech would forward me a news article about Orion Gate's decline. Another lawsuit settled, another contract lost. The bankruptcy filing hadn't been public yet, but anyone who could read a balance sheet knew it was coming, and I didn't feel triumphant so much as I felt finished. The fight was over. One Thursday afternoon, James Harper stopped by my office with a set of schematics for a municipal security project in Phoenix. "We want you to lead this one," he said. "Your track record with Fort Wayne and Chicago speaks for itself." I nodded, already picturing the architecture, the redundancies, the safeguards. This was the work I'd always loved, building something that mattered, that worked, that outlasted the noise of boardroom politics. On my drive home that evening, I thought about the last year. The boardroom humiliation, the elevator ride with the countdown ticking, the diner booth with Ethan's face draining of color, and the slow, deliberate collapse of the empire he'd thought was his alone. At a red light, I glanced at my phone. Kelly had sent me a picture from her studio, a nearly finished landscape, the colors rich and deep. "Dinner at 7, the message read. I smiled. For the first time in years, my life wasn't about keeping someone else's machine running. It was about building my own, and making sure the people I cared about could do the same. It was a Saturday morning, the kind that feels earned. No alarms, no urgent calls, no half-read emails over cold coffee. Just sunlight through the kitchen window and the quiet hum of the coffee maker. Kelly sat across from me at the small oak table we'd had since our first apartment. She had her hands wrapped around a mug, paint still faintly smudged along the side of her thumb from a late-night session in the studio. We talked about nothing for a while, a new bakery opening down the street, the neighbor's dog who'd taken to napping in our yard, the weather in Phoenix, where I'd be heading next month for the municipal project. It was the kind of conversation that happens when your life isn't on fire anymore. Then she tilted her head and asked, "Any regrets?" It was a simple question, but it landed like a stone in a still pond. I thought about it. I thought about Ethan in that boardroom, smirking as he told me to pack my things, about the elevator ride with the muffled shouts bleeding through the doors, about the diner booth where I'd slid the licensing agreement across the table and watched his confidence crack open. I thought about the 14 years before that, the garage with the peeling paint, the late nights spent debugging while Ethan worked the phones, the press conference where he took credit for my work without blinking. I thought about all the smaller moments I'd let slide, the small cuts that didn't seem fatal at the time. And then I thought about where I was now, the Phoenix project, my own office at Orion Tech, my name on patents that couldn't be touched, Kelly painting full-time, sunlight pouring into her studio, the steady hum of a life built on my terms, not someone else's agenda. Only that it took me this long to stop letting him write my story, I said. Kelly smiled softly, the kind of smile that said she'd been waiting to hear those words for a long time. We sipped our coffee in silence after that, but it wasn't the heavy kind of silence. It was the kind that lets the answer settle in, the kind that says the page has turned and you're not looking back. Later that day, I took a walk through our neighborhood. The air was cool and the leaves were just starting to shift into autumn colors. I passed kids riding bikes, couples working in their yards, a teenager mowing a lawn with headphones in. Nobody knew or cared that, a few months ago, I'd dismantled a company from the inside without laying a finger on their servers. And that was fine. I didn't need applause. What mattered was that the work I'd done, the systems, the protocols, the redundancies, was still mine in the ways that counted. And the people who tried to erase me from that picture were now footnotes in a story they'd thought they controlled. The truth is, Ethan never really understood the value of what we built together. To him, it was always about leverage, what could be traded, sold, spun into a deal. To me, it was about the architecture, the integrity of a system that could hold under pressure. That's why I survived when he didn't. Jason, I heard he's doing contract work now, fixing routers in office parks and troubleshooting for outdated payroll software. There's nothing wrong with that kind of work. It's honest. But it's a long way from the corner office Ethan promised him. Ethan himself is still in Cleveland, still selling, but not running anything. My guess is, every time he sits across from a client, there's a part of him that remembers the day the lights went out and never fully came back on. If you've never had someone try to erase your work, it's hard to explain the sting of it. It's not just about the credit, though that matters. It's about the story, about waking up one day and realizing someone else has been holding the pen, deciding what gets remembered and what gets left out. That morning in the boardroom, Ethan tried to write my ending. He wanted it short, clean, forgettable. Instead, I took the pen back, and so here's the question I'll leave you with. If someone tried to erase your work, would you hand them the pen or take it back?